There was some sort of a glimmer, maybe in the very, very early 1960s, when press reports started appearing about Jews not getting matzah in the Soviet Union during Passover. But really, for me, as a political science student at Queens College, I think the first time it really struck home was reading the January 1963 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. There was a groundbreaking article called The Status of Jews in the Soviet Union by a gentleman named Mr. Moshe Dechter. Now, Moshe Dechter was a very interesting individual. He was a leftist. He was the editor of leftist magazines. But unbeknownst to all of us for many years, the Israeli government quietly gave him information, statistical information about Soviet Jews. And he put together a remarkable article which appeared in the most prestigious of all the Foreign Affairs magazine. And it said that Soviet Jews were locked into discrimination. And I had been involved at that point or was getting involved in the American Civil Rights Movement. And I found other people who were also other Jews who were also involved in the Civil Rights Movement. And together we said, look, if we're working for the rights of American blacks, then certainly we should be working for the rights of our own people who are being discriminated against. And that was 1963. Things slowly evolved. And by April of 1964, we had already for several months before that met up with Jacob Birnbaum, who was trying on his own to interest people in the plight of Soviet Jews. And by the end of April 1964, we had a meeting at Columbia University. It was a very exciting meeting. Young Jews were discovering that there were a whole group of their own people, 25% of their own people, who were in terrible shape. And now we had some information to go through, not much, but we had some. And we resolved that 4 days later, on May Day 1964, we would go out and march at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. So we worked like crazy. We stayed up all night. So we contacted everybody we knew. We put up flyers and posters. And I think young Jews who saw the idealism of the American civil rights movement and wanted to do something for fellow Jews found their groove. And all of a sudden, 1,100 young Jews came out from the woodwork, not because we were such brilliant organizers. And in 4 days, we came out and marched for 4 hours silently at the Soviet mission to the UN. And that was the last time, of course, that we were silent, because we said at that particular time, well, if Soviet Jews are silent, so we should march in silence. But we never made that mistake again.
Daniel, that was 1964, right?
64. The article appeared in January 63.
Okay. You want to... Oh, wait, I was just curious.
You're never going to get anything totally silent. You realize that? I mean, it's not just never going to happen in this area.
Yeah, but that was...
You want to redo it, or is it?
Well, just the part that you said, that why did you march in silence?
Okay. On May Day 1964, we had over 1,100...
Sorry, look at her. Don't look at me.
Yeah. It's not
Okay.
the camera, me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, just the last sentence. Just
Right, okay. On May Day 1964, we had over 1,100 students marching in silence at the Soviet mission to the UN, because we said, well, if Soviet Jews are forced into silence, we should march in silence. And it's the last time we made a mistake like that.
Nice. No, he's not coming? Okay. Brian? I just don't want him to come in the middle of the sentence. Okay. So, you You had, can you tell me a little bit about the student struggle for Soviet Jewry before 1970, before the trial, and after? What was the difference?
Okay. From 1964 to 1970, we worked every day. We had an office. We were students, and then we became ex-students. New students kept on coming in, and it was continuous activity, and it was activist, but it wasn't the highest profile.
Sorry, cut. Too low? Too loud?
I mean, we can hear it. It's not like it's drowning out his voice or anything like that. It's the background, but it's certainly audible.
Okay. Lily, can you check with Brian if he's like, where is he? Why is he not coming in? I need to understand the difference because, here they are. Yeah, you can come in. You can come in.
Come in,
You can
come
find
in,
him?
wherever you are.
So, can you hear when we talk from the outside? Can you hear if he's talking or I'm talking? No?
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Because the longer you go, the more people there are going to be outside as the day progresses.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. Okay,
Okay, so here we go.
So, you understand my question, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. From 1964 to 1970, let's start again. From 1964 to 1970, the student struggle for Soviet Jewry was active every day. Countless demonstrations, rallies, marches, all sorts of things. But we didn't get the highest kind of visibility, the visibility we wanted. We simply, if we couldn't break out in the Jewish community, it was hardly to be expected that we could break out in the general community. Although, I must say, after our very first demonstration on May 1st, 1964, we had a big article on page 2 of the New York Times, probably because what we did was so unusual for its time. Jews demonstrating for Soviet Jews. But until the time of the trial, even as appeals started coming out of the Soviet Union very quietly, one by one, and then joint appeals, and then Jews in the Soviet Union in different places actually started demonstrating. It wasn't until the time of the Leningrad Trial that the dam burst.
And why is that? What was the difference?
It was so quantitatively different. It was a whole quantum leap from what we had been doing, what Soviet Jews had been doing. It was absolutely different. Also remember the background. This was a time that there were different hijackings. This was a time that the United States government and the Soviet Union were trying to get together to talk about trade, to talk about arms limitations. So all of these things began to converge. In 1970, after the attempted taking of the plane by the Jews in Leningrad, there was another attempt a successful attempt by a couple of Lithuanians, nationalists, to hijack a plane and fly it to Turkey. You had in December 1970, also at the time that the Leningrad Trial began, this whole convention, this conference of over 70 countries meeting in Switzerland to talk about the scourge of hijacking and what to do about it. And these countries pledging that they'll take the most serious measures. So by the time that the Leningrad Trial actually began in mid-1970, many of these things began to come together. And I think also remember, in terms of American Jews, you had in 1966, Elie Wiesel's book, The Jews of Silence, in which he excoriated American Jews for being the Jews who really were silent on behalf of their brethren in the Soviet Union. In 1968, you had a book, While 6 Million Died, by Arthur Morse. This was a book which detailed the relative silence of American Jews during the Shoah. You had the civil rights movement, which gave way to the anti-war movement in which young Americans, in general, young Americans, were questioning their parents' generation. So many of these forces started coming together.
And I was actually thinking a lot about why this was different, because other actions were made before, like.
Well,
and also-
let's roll the tape. Okay, so then let's start going back and see how things beginning to dawn on us. Okay, nobody knew. At least those of us in the West didn't know that an attempted taking of the plane had occurred on June 15th, 1970. On June 21st, we at Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry began to get word that Jews in several Soviet cities were being arrested, homes raided. In fact, we went out to demonstrate on June 21st, the morning after we learned about this. But we didn't know that there had been an attempt to take a plane at the Smolny airport in Leningrad. We just didn't know about it. The only information came a week after the attempted, quote, hijacking, with an article in Leningradskaya Pravda, which couldn't even be subscribed to by foreign correspondents in Moscow. Somebody happened to see the article, and the information started rolling from there. And there was a lot of confusion. We just didn't know how many people, didn't exactly know the names, no internet, no Skype, no texting.
Hey, just a second, that was too loud, right? What was that, the last one?
That was somebody's voice.
Okay.
So,
The information came out very slowly. The Soviet Union was sealed. We didn't know. Just a little confusion, maybe some piece of information here. Somebody got a phone call in Israel. Boris Penson was Boris Pestner. Really were unsure of the information. And slowly over the course of the weeks, and really a couple of months, we began to find out information. Even in October, there were still reports that Mark Dymshits, who was going to be the pilot of the plane, was an agent provocateur of the KGB. Just that information just wasn't there. Now, could you say that maybe somebody in Israel had this information and they didn't want to share it because it would look bad for Israel, because the hijackers or the putative hijackers had wanted to go to Israel ultimately? The answer is, who knows? Maybe they were as clueless as we were. We just don't know. But slowly the scope of the arrests, which spread in different cities in the Soviet Union, in Kishinev and Riga and Leningrad and other places, and the scope of the Soviet squeeze began to become apparent. And the Soviets officials beginning to talk about a trial and death penalty. Well, I think the wheels started beginning to turn, and a little bit faster and a little bit faster and a little bit faster. And over the course of several months, this whole thing began to build up as information began to trickle out from the Soviet Union. So we at Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, for instance, had a big rally at the Diamond Center in Manhattan. There were other rallies near the United Nations. We would demonstrate at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. Slowly, things began to mobilize. Even what we called the Jewish establishment in the United States, big Jewish organizations, slowly began to get their act together.
yes.
The pieces of paper are reflecting, I guess.
Oh, mine?
I guess it's yours, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, is it okay when I'm holding it like this? You don't see me, right?
Can you look at each other for just a minute, please?
Can you?
What else am I seeing there? Oh, that's his. Okay, that he's holding it. Okay. Yeah, if you hold it up like that, I think that's
Okay. Just a second. We don't. I have. I need.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, there's all sorts
No,
of
I have-
details, but I think we,
Yeah, but I really want to establish the.
before and after.
Well, not exactly before and after, but just I remember you told me that first when you saw what did you when you first saw the newspaper saying the Jews tried to hijack an airplane. What did you think about it?
We said, my God, how desperate these Jews must be to leave. Yes, we had seen individual appeals beginning, let's say, 2 years before by Boris Kachabayevsky. We saw individual acts of heroism, let's say, by Yasha Kazakov. We began to see in 1969 the appeals of the 18 Georgian Jewish families. But this was, again, the quantum leap. This was unbelievable. Jews so desperate to leave. They weren't just demonstrating and going out to demonstrate at the Supreme Soviet in Moscow or something like that, which was dangerous enough, but actually trying to take a plane to leave. My God.
And I know that after the hijacking, between the hijacking and the trial itself, the trial itself was in December 15th, it still wasn't that famous, and the demonstration was there were not a lot of demonstration, not as much as after the trial. Why do you think that? What was the difference between, why during this time before the trial and after the trial, why is it different?
Very simple. When the act begins, like any, it's human nature. When the act begins, that's when you react. If something terrible is about to happen, most people will wait till something terrible actually happens. That's simply the way it works. You galvanize people during the trial, and when the death sentences came, and it looked, really bad, that's when everybody got galvanized. And again, it takes time to organize. Yes, student struggle for Soviet Jewry, we can get our 100 people out in the street, 200 people, 300, 400 people out in the street. Jewish Defense League could get their people out in the street, scream and yell, get arrested at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. But it takes time to get the ball rolling, especially at that time where you didn't have the technological ability to move things terribly fast.
What would happen if on the trial the whole group would say, we're sorry, we didn't mean to do it?
Well, that's to some extent, I can't say it happened that way, but it certainly happened in some of the subsequent trials. I don't remember whether it was the second one in Leningrad, the one in Riga, the one in Kishinev. For instance, one of the Jews, Boris Mavtsier, broke. Had that happened, I think we would have said, well, the KGB broke them. The KGB, these are just ordinary Jews who wanted to leave, plus two non-Jews, Fedorov and Berzhenko, who threw their lot with the Jews as some desperate way to get out of the Soviet Union. But the vast majority out of the 16 people who were ultimately going to be on the plane, we're talking about 13 who were not really involved before in political activity, the Gulag, or anything else. So it would have been natural. The fact that Silva got up and spoke so strongly in court. By the way, Yosef Mendelevich told me often that he really thought that his comrades were going to be broken because, remember, people were separated from each other before the trial. He says he remembers initially when they were arrested hearing Silva crying in her cell. He really thought that there was a real possibility of everybody breaking, or some of the people breaking. And he was astounded. He was astounded that just simply they had somehow gained in all this time fortitude instead of being broken.
Do you think this is part of the reason that people in the world reacted like that? Because finally...
We didn't know until sometime later the actual words that were spoken by the defendants at the trial. We reacted more to the trial, to the desperation of these Jews to leave, and also to these sentences. We're talking about sentences to death sentences. We're talking about sentences of 15 years. And even when the Soviets, the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation met, and very swiftly, within a few days, and the death sentences became 15 years, and some of the 15 years became maybe 13 or 14 years. It's still, we reacted.
Brian, you can see him. Brian, do you want to come in? Yeah. We were waiting for you, and then we just decided to continue.
We decided it's better. We're just going
go.
We're just going to do a cartoon, and that's it. Okay.
Quickly. If you want to go, you want to be here? Okay.
But remember, this whole thing.
Just a second. Please sit down there. And camera still rolling? Sound?
Okay. Remember, this whole thing began to build up slowly. It was like a locomotive beginning to pick up steam. You had to find the pieces to get on the locomotive. You had to find who was going to drive the locomotive. You had to have a destination for the locomotive. And finally, the thing picked up. And we're talking about demonstrations and rallies that were held across Europe. I mean, longshoremen demonstrating in Italy. If I remember, people even possibly, if I recall correctly, people even shouting out when the Pope was speaking. And people who we never expected to speak out. And remember also, the Soviet Union was also protesting at the same time, not about the Jews, but about the fact that in fascist Spain, 6 Basque terrorists were being sentenced to death.
I'm sorry, wasn't it 2? I think it was 2.
It's 2?
Pretty sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just say Basque terrorists.
Yeah, it's Yakov Kedmi. He said 2 as well, and.
Okay, one second. Let me see if I have any notes.
Okay. I'll just say Basque terrorist if you're not sure.
But I want to see. Maybe you're right. Six, but we'll say Basque terrorists.
Can you just say Basque? Yeah, because
I'll say Basque terrorists,
okay.
yes.
So let's go back to there were demonstrations in Russia, in Soviet Union.
Okay. No, well, there were protests by the Soviet Union. There were protests by the Soviet Union at this point, but not about the Jews who were going to be sentenced, but protests by the Soviet government of the death sentences handed out against Basque terrorists under the fascist administration of Francisco Franco in Spain. So you had this tremendous disparity going on. And people said, look, these folks just want freedom. So the locomotive really was running at full speed at that particular point.
Do you know about the censorship in Israel of the Soviet Jewry? Do you know why it happened and how it stopped?
Okay, let's do a quick review.
Yeah.
Israel is a democracy, but it's not an American democracy. Israel is a threatened small country. The Soviet Jewry office in Israel, called Lishkat HaKesher, the Liaison Bureau, was set up by guys who were previously involved in the Mossad, Israeli Secret Service. And those were the guys who were previously involved with Aliyah Bet, the smuggling of Jews into Palestine during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, but before the creation of the state. So you had a whole operation run by guys who were closed-mouthed, who took orders, who didn't question. And Israel always said, listen, we're always at war. We got bigger people coming after us. We have Arab enemies all around us. There's a certain discipline that has to be maintained. There's a military censorship that was well known, and in fact, even today, certain things have to be submitted to military censorship before being released for publication. Israel didn't have TV, just had radio, no internet. You really didn't know too much what was going on from the outside unless you had the money to go buy a newspaper at a stand that might have an outside newspaper in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or someplace like that. So the Israeli government felt it had the burden of world Jewry on its shoulders. They felt they were responsible for the safety of Jews worldwide. And in that respect, the guys who were tasked with this were the guys from the Lishkat HaKesher, from the Liaison Bureau. They didn't take no garbage from nobody. That's simply the way they worked. Example, in 1970, my wife and I sat down in Tel
Just a
Aviv.
second. Sorry, too much. And
Okay.
now it stops. Just a second. I wanna. Do you remember I sent you the email about Golda and Stalin?
Quiet. It's low.
with the
Yes, and
letter?
you
So
never.
It wasn't. I asked a few more people. It wasn't a letter that was sent. It was just that Golda, she was in 1948. She was in Russia.
Right, she was the
She
Israeli
was
ambassador.
meeting some people,
Yeah.
and the people she met later on were
No,
arrested.
I'll tell you the story.
Okay, and I think that was the reason for
I'll tell you the story.
the censorship.
I'll tell you the story. No, that's not the reason for the censorship. It was the general Israeli attitude. But that was 48. This we're already talking about
No,
1964.
I'm just curious about why.
So let's okay.
Why Israel had censorship?
So let me go back through this again.
Okay, just a second. Can we, Daniel? No, no, this is too much.
The
Okay.
backing up of the truck, yeah.
It's not a backing up for truck. It's something, or you know what it may be.
What?
It's even conceivable, though I don't think so. Maybe some of these school buses. Maybe.
If it's school bus, so it means it's gonna end soon.
Right, yeah. But the kids are brought in slowly. These are kids who have,
Oh, yeah.
these are kids who have difficulty, so they can't just, they go out slowly. These are kids who have
But here you go. it's
psychological
quiet now,
problem.
So should we just continue?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Great. So why Israel had censorship?
Okay, you want to start the whole thing all over again?
Well.
Okay. Do you want to run it from the beginning, or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
The Israeli government had a long history of military censorship, and simply it worked on the basis we're a small little country, we're surrounded by enemies, we cannot afford to make one mistake. You make one mistake and you're gone. The Israeli government felt itself responsible for Jews, for the safety of Jews in other parts of the world. The people who ran the Lishkat HaKesher, the Liaison Bureau, the secret Soviet Jewry office, were the guys who were formerly from the Mossad, Israel's Secret Service. And they were in turn formerly the people who ran the clandestine immigration, Aliyah Bet, of Jews from Europe during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust until the creation of the State of Israel from Europe. And therefore everybody was closed-mouthed. You didn't say anything, you didn't have to. You took your orders, you didn't question anybody. And this is simply part of the scene in Israel. That was simply the way it worked. When my wife and I in 1970 sat down with Nehemiah Levanon, who was running the Soviet Jewry office, the Liaison Bureau, he said to us, well, how do you decide to do things in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry? So like naive young people, my wife and I said to Nehemiah, we do what we think is right. Nehemiah was scandalized. He said, your problem is you don't take orders. And back in 1948, when Golda Meir-Sen, who then became Golda Meir, was the Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union, when she came to the synagogue, I think it was Rosh Hashanah, somehow, miraculously, tens of thousands of Jews appeared out of nowhere to greet her. People were just ecstatic. These were the beginning of the black years for Soviet Jews. I mean, it was a terrible time. Stalin was at his full powers. Some Jews were more exuberant in greeting Golda. And a number of those Jews whom the KGB fingered as being more exuberant in greeting Golda found themselves in the Gulag. So the Israelis were very careful. Nehemiah Levanon, in the early 1950s, was posted to the Israeli embassy in Moscow. Some of the people whom Nehemiah met themselves were arrested. So everybody was very, very, very careful. It's not like we were different. We were young American Jews. We didn't have the mentality from World War II when it was, we didn't know, you don't ask, you want to do something, you get permission from somebody else. It wasn't that. This was the time of the civil rights movement, breaking boundaries. Later on, the time of the anti-war movement, anti-establishment, anti-anybody who's an adult. It was the time of the breaking of boundaries, and we didn't fit that mold anymore, but we were dealing with people who came from that mold.
And so there was a conflict because there were the government, I would say, more would think, and I think even the Jewish establishment, even in America, would think that you should be silenced, that it should be.
Okay. The Jewish establishment in the United States generally took its lead on foreign affairs, meaning, let's say, the Soviet Union, from the Israeli government, whom they felt knew better. What did they know? There was a delegation of American rabbis who went in the late 1950s. There was a Reform delegation, an Orthodox delegation who went in. So you went to one or two cities, you met Jews in the synagogue or whatever, scared Jews. But what did you know? The Israelis knew. And then, very quietly, the Lishka was putting out some information. What's an example? Moshe Dechter. Moshe Dechter was tasked, who was the editor of a magazine called The New Leader, a leftist magazine, but also had a wonderful Jewish heart, was tasked by the Israelis. They asked him, and I assume they probably paid him, to open up a place called the Jewish Minorities Research Bureau. And all of a sudden, Dechter and his compatriot in London, Emmanuel Litvinov, were pumping out information that had never been seen before. That's how you got the status of Jews in the Soviet Union in Foreign Affairs magazine. So the information was limited. It was controlled by the Israeli government. They used it actually as a weapon. Information became a weapon. If you played ball with them, you could get some information. If you didn't play ball with them, you weren't going to get that information. So that's how they worked. But we were different. America was different. Europe was different also. In Europe, you have a centralized Jewish community. You have more deference to the establishment. In the United States, there were establishment Jewish organizations. The organizations today that have begun a little bit to fade from the scene, like B'nai B'rith as an example, they were big. They were big. And again, people took orders from those whom they thought knew better. But our generation, we just simply didn't grow up in that modality. Now, at the same time, there was some other interesting psychological deal here going on. We were motivated as young Jews by the civil rights movement. We weren't yet haunted by any reference to the Shoah. Yes, Jacob Birnbaum, who grew up as a child under the Nazis, he knew about the Shoah, and he referenced the Shoah.
Can you say Holocaust? I'll just need
Okay.
to keep on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jacob Birnbaum knew about the Shoah, but 3, 2, 1. We really didn't know too much about the Holocaust. Most parents who had gone through the Holocaust weren't talking that much to their kids about it. Some did, but most didn't. It wasn't until 1960, as an example, with the Eichmann trial, that information began to really get into the consciousness of our generation. But that didn't mean that knowing about Eichmann didn't mean that we knew that American Jews were relatively silent during the Holocaust. It was only in 1968, 8 years later, 4 years after the Soviet Jewry movement began, that the book, While 6 Million Died, came out, which was an indictment of the American Jewish establishment at that particular time. So we're dealing with different modalities, different mentalities. In Israel, you came into the country, you were in the army. You're in the army, you take orders. It's again, that's the way it worked over there. There was indeed a cultural clash. And American Jewish organizations, the big Jewish organizations, remember some of their leaders even had been leaders like Isaiah Minkoff as an example. I remember him, an elderly gentleman, very distinguished gentleman, but he had been a Jewish organization leader even at the time of the Holocaust.
I would just like make it into one sentence. I'll tell you what I would like to I want to, because this is really
Right.
short, but I want to move on.
Yeah.
But it's important for me that you say it. If you can say something like that the Israeli government had censorship because they were afraid it will harm
Okay.
the Soviet Jews, and we didn't believe it that way, and then, but just
Okay.
like make it short, not explain exactly why,
Okay.
but just
Okay,
explain
fine.
the
Okay.
situation. Yeah.
Okay. Israel's a country surrounded by enemies. Israel's a country that had to work under pressure, carefully. What you did mattered. Israel took things one way, carefully guarded, hierarchical. We had a different mentality. We were young American Jews. We didn't have the mentality of our parents during the Holocaust. We didn't take orders in general, and the 1960s was certainly a generation of Jews who questioned authority.
Yeah, that's good. Oh, okay. Oh, you answered most questions already. That's awesome. Oh, how did you feel after the death sentence was reduced?
You want to give me that New York Post headline? I want to hold it up because I'm going to tell you how good I felt. But it was very, but it was qualified. Yeah, if you have water.
Oh,
You could hear it already, right? You could hear my voice.
let's see.
Yeah, that one at New York Post. It says.
one?
Yes, that's it.
But be careful when you're holding it because it's noisy. So it's either you hold it to the camera. Exactly.
Okay.
Daniel,
Fill in
is
the
that
fill in the blanks.
It's a.
Okay. Okay. Now, we had been out demonstrating day after day, night after night, before the trials, during the trials, after the death sentences. And to see this, we said, wow! But we understood it was very qualified. Because, death sentence, 15 years? Okay, 15 years is a slow death as well.
It's okay.
Can you do that one more time?
Why?
No.
I mean, do you feel like
You
you were demonstrating?
We felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment. This was the mighty Soviet Union. Whoever gave in to the mighty Soviet Union? Who could win against the mighty Soviet Union? But remember, it wasn't just us. We were talking about worldwide demonstrations, rally, pressure. Golda Meir sent a representative to Francisco Franco and said, listen, Generalissimo Franco, you're sentencing these bastards to death. But, you could get back at the Soviet Union if you commute their sentence. Because if you commute the sentence, then how could the Soviet Union say the fascist dictator commuted the sentences and we, the progressives, didn't? So Franco gave in. Franco commuted the sentences. But we understood that 15 years was not, freedom.
But still, I'm sure it make you.
As I said,
Give
It
you
was it was a
inspiration.
tremendous sense of satisfaction. Yes, it was inspiration because we realized that we actually got something done, but it wasn't total relief because we couldn't. We knew at that point there were already other trials coming up. I don't know if we knew yet that it was going to be another one in Leningrad, and then one in Riga, then one in Kishinev, but we knew Jews had been arrested in different cities. We knew Jews were under pressure. We knew Jewish houses were being searched. So it was not the end of the story, but it was a tremendous satisfaction to know we had gotten at least that step forward.
Can you give him the water? Sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Terrific.
How much?
Should I tell you one funny incident?
What? I have a few actually.
Okay. No, I'll tell you that story
But
about
before you talk, look at it and then put it aside. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to see which
I
performance
have a
it was.
I have a funny something else if you
Okay,
want.
but hold on one
You can do
second.
mine first.
Yeah, oh, yes.
That's fine. We have until 4. Okay. Thanks.
A week before the trial began, a Soviet circus was performing in New York. So, and this was a Soviet ice circus. So we said, fine. So we went out and did a counter demonstration. And we called it Judaism under ice. And we told people, there's a trial about to begin of Jews who just want to leave, to go to Israel. And we had a circus, and we said, come see the Jews, see the Soviet circus, come see the Jews in chains, come see the Jews who aren't permitted to go to their homeland. And handing out phony programs to the circus as people were going in. And one woman, I remember, came over to us and said, you know what, you're right. Let me ask my husband, but I want to hand back my ticket. And she went over to her husband. Her husband said, shut up and go in.
You know, I noticed a few letters and songs that you wrote about Silva, and you thought she was pregnant.
We thought maybe we thought she was pregnant because maybe that was the. Look, wait 1 second.
You know, no, the point I'm trying to make is that obviously, you know, Mary was pregnant and not my mother. But then, you know, I
But the answer would
just
be,
thought that you have so little information,
That's right.
and
That's
a
right.
lot of it was wrong.
That's right. Again, there was very hard to get information out. Look, until even in October of 1970, there were still reports that Mark Dymshits, instead of being one of the great heroes of the story, was actually a KGB provocateur who was sent in by the secret police to entrap these Jews. We just didn't know. We didn't know. Hard to get information out. Now, again, whether the Israeli government was embarrassed by this whole thing and had information and didn't let it be known, or whether the Israeli government simply, like the rest of us, just didn't know, we don't know. We don't know. But like anything else, as I said, it was like a locomotive beginning to gain steam. As things went on, it became clearer what went on. But you didn't have reporters reporting from the scene in Leningrad. There were almost no reports. The only reports were local newspapers that then had to be brought into Moscow to be given to the foreign correspondents, or maybe a couple of phone calls that were allowed to go to Israel for a couple of minutes with some information coming out. We just didn't know. We didn't know. I mean, did somebody maybe say that Silva was pregnant because this would have gotten more sympathy, or whether it was confused with Mary Knach? We don't know. It didn't matter at that point. I mean, we went with what we had. We used our guts, you know, like something outrageous we probably discounted, but we just didn't know. When the trial was going to begin, exactly who, what was happening. Remember, all these people were being kept isolated before the trial. We didn't know. And if even Yosef Mendelevich didn't know until the courtroom whether or not his comrades had been broken, how could you expect anybody on the West to know?
Can you give me in points some of the things that were wrong, and I can help you? Starting with, I saw on the newscast it says 11 were on trial. There was actually 12 on trial. You thought Silva was...
No, 11, no, that's not true. 11 were on trial because
I counted.
Wolf had a separate military trial. Remember that. So there were 11 on trial, 9 Jews, 2 non-Jews, and a separate military tribunal for Wolf Salmonson, who, remember, was officially in the Soviet military.
Okay, that's why. Yeah, and I was thinking, okay, I just thought they had a lot of mistakes because of...
There's plenty of mistakes. There are plenty of
Can you
mistakes.
give me just a bullet point? Bullet point. Oh no, if not, then never
I
mind.
listen, who's going to remember? Who's going to remember that kind of information at that particular point?
No, it's just...
By December, well, I'll say here.
No,
well,
just bullet points.
But just say, for instance, 2 days after the trial began, on December 17th, we knew that 11 people were on trial. But then it became clear that a 12th was going to go on trial, Wolf Salmonson, in a military trial.
Okay. Okay, so the death sentence was reduced. What is your next move now?
I think the first thing is we took a collective sigh of relief and probably about 30 minutes just to rest. And we began again because we knew there were trials beginning. And now again, we didn't know when those trials, the second round of trials, were to begin, because the reports they were going to be immediately. Then it was going to be in a few weeks. Then it was going to be more than a few weeks. Probably the Soviets were trying to figure out what to do, how to maneuver, how to react. They reacted already once. And should they react again? What should they do? So instead of doing quick 1, 2, 3, 4 trials, the thing spread out over the course of several months. And we girded ourselves up for the probability of trials. We continued with demonstrations and rallies. And remember, there were all sorts of pressures. It wasn't just us in the streets anymore. We're now talking about Jewish establishment dealing on a high level. A group already had met with President Nixon. We had statements out by, meaning the collective American Jewish community, had statements out from members of Congress. All sorts of important personalities were putting out statements. People involved in the various peace movements, the civil rights movements. There was a gearing up for more at that point. Now, the other trials didn't get the same sort of response for the simple reason that the sentences weren't as harsh. I mean, Ruthie Alexandrovich, as an example, in Riga, who was one of the people involved in sort of planning and things like that. Well, Ruthie only got 1 year. And by the end of 1971, she actually served less time. By the end of 1971, she was already out. So by December 1971, she was already in New York at this huge rally that we ran at Madison Square Garden called Freedom Lights for Soviet Jews. So we continued, but by that point, the Soviet Jewry movement really had been gotten on, can't say steroids, but it gotten really a spring in its step. It really entered a totally new phase. And also remember, in February of 1971, the Lishka had organized a world conference on Soviet Jews in Brussels, Belgium. Now, you could say that that conference sort of had like just low-level type of stuff and wasn't really an action plan. Yes, but the fact of the matter is that delegations came in from around the world. I remember seeing people from also Jews from all sorts of countries, personalities coming and speaking. It didn't mean that much. Ben-Gurion came and spoke, and he was very ill, but he came and spoke. The point is that this was now coalescing slowly into a worldwide movement, as maybe certainly not as strong as we wanted, not as sharp as we wanted, but I was meeting students from Europe, from Israel, from South America in Brussels, and we began to really start to coordinate.
Were you doing that full time? Because it was for a course of a lot of years and you had to... keep it alive somehow.
Yes.
Yes, what? They
Okay.
can't hear my question.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I simply made a commitment. When my wife and I got married in 1967, we said to each other, we're going to do what we want to do. So my wife wanted to get involved in education of poor children. So she did. She became a New York City public school teacher. She later became highly involved in Jewish education at the same time. I wanted to do Soviet Jewry work. I was in law school for a year. That was enough for me. So by 1967, I was really doing full-time Soviet Jewry stuff. That's what I wanted to do. Okay, the money wasn't that important. I felt that there were certain times that you're presented with a challenge, and either you take the challenge or you let the challenge pass by. So I said to myself, this is the challenge, let's do it. I don't think at that point in 1964 or 67, I thought this was going to go on and on and on for 26 years. But the fact of the matter is, so you made a commitment, There was a lot of idealism around also in the 1960s.
You know what? I didn't ask you. I'm just very curious. So you hear the death sentence, and then in a matter of days, I see archives of New York City, like the whole city is packed with the thousands of people. How did that happen in just a matter of days?
Again, this whole thing built up from over the course of several months, from the time that we learned about the trial to the time of the trial. And so let's say you had 10,000 people gathering at one particular spot. People felt it in their guts. Okay, yeah, objectively, let's say 7 million people in New York, 10,000 people rally, but you hadn't seen rallies really of that size at that point yet for Soviet Jews. So people felt it. Death sentences for fellow Jews, all they wanted to go was out. They couldn't live in the Soviet Union as Jews. I mean, what's the problem? They felt it. They felt vulnerable. And remember also, this is one generation past the Holocaust. By 1970 already, you had the Wiesel speaking out. The Jews of silence are not the Jews in the Soviet Union, he said. These are your Western Jews, your American Jews. You're the Jews of silence. You have, 6 million died by Arthur Morse. You guys were quiet during the Holocaust. Yeah, give me any excuse you want, but you were quiet. 6 million Jews died. What are you doing? So by 1970 already, you had this sense, we better come out this time.
Did you know how Silva was released? Do you know about that story?
We, on the grassroots level, the street protesters, even people like us who went and lobbied, we also initiated lobbying in Congress. But we weren't privy to any of the backroom, high-level types of negotiations. We weren't the ones who met with the president. We weren't the ones who met with other heads of state. Yeah, we were the engine that provided the strength for other people to go and meet with the big shots, but that was not our role. So we simply felt that it was the collective kind of protest and pressure that everybody had been putting on for 4 years for Silva to be released. It wasn't important exactly how or who, because in each of these things I have seen over the course of all these years that a lot of people took credit. Example, when Sharansky got released, we got hundreds of phone calls. You see, I protested, I released Sharansky. So we were going to print up 2,000 buttons that said, I personally released Anatoly Sharansky. That was not as important. It was interesting to know.
I'm just curious, I know, I'm just curious if you can just tell me if you know the details. I can tell you and then you can just...
Remind me of the details.
That there was a prisoner exchange with a Russian spy from Israel government to Soviet Union called Yuri Linov.
No, but
So-
there were many different, look, there were many different spy exchanges. First of all, remember, in 1979, when your father was released.
Oh no, not my father, Edward Kuznetsov. Because
Okay, you don't want to
yeah.
say, okay, fine. You don't reveal that in this.
No, I don't mind. It's just that you don't hear my questions. So
You
that
don't hear your
people-
questions.
yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I didn't understand. Okay, fine.
Okay.
So here we go.
Yeah.
So let me assume that I'm not responding particularly to the question. How did Silva get released? Again, it said the details weren't important. Were there spy exchanges? Look, throughout the whole procedure, everybody used the rubric of spy exchanges. It was very convenient. When Silva got released, it was a spy exchange. In 1979, there were two groups of spies, if I remember, who were released. First of all, there were the 5 Jews involved who were part of a second.
Let's stay just
okay.
in 1974 because in the film I'm not gonna go to.
You're not gonna get to 79 yet? Okay,
well,
fine.
Well, just at the end, not.
Okay, fine.
No,
Okay,
I'm just
okay.
curious.
A spy release gave everybody a chance to say, we got something out of the deal. The Americans could get rid of somebody, or they could get somebody. The Russians could get somebody back. The Israelis could get rid of somebody. The Israelis could get somebody. It was a good package for everybody.
And do you remember how did you hear about Silva's release? You personally?
You want to know the truth? I don't remember at the moment. I just don't remember.
Do you remember seeing it on television?
No, but if I went and refreshed my memory, I probably would. Frankly, I don't remember.
Okay.
I just literally don't remember.
So can you tell me about her activities after she was released, from what you know?
Well, first of all, when Silva got released, it was really an issue first of her getting healthy, getting well. Then she began to feel, as I remember, these tremendous inner feelings of she's released for a reason. And the reason has to be that she has to advocate for Edward, for Wolf, for Israel, for all the other prisoners, and in fact, indeed, for all other Soviet Jews. So by 1975, the next year after she was released, she approached the Lishka, the Israeli Liaison Bureau, and said, would you help me get to New York? I want to stage a hunger strike for my husband, my brothers, the other prisoners. And Tzvi Netzer in the Lishka, Nehemiah Levanon in the Lishka said, no. They said, you're going to make more trouble than you're going to help. We know better than you do. She said, fine. I'm going to use the proceeds of the sale of my husband's book to get over to the United States, and I'm going to stage a hunger strike. Once Silva came to the United States, well, the Jewish establishment couldn't say no. They didn't really want to help her, but they couldn't say no, especially since us pipsqueaks, the students, were going to help her. So everybody eventually pitched in. And Silva had an incredible, those images remain in my mind, lying in this chair, this beach chair, at this dramatic Isaiah wall that says, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It's right across from the United Nations, where you have the Secretariat building and all the 100 flags flying of all the countries. And Silva is lying there, and Silva day after day after day, and we're with her in the morning, with her all day, in the evening, and she just goes on day after day. Yigal alone ended up visiting her. But in the beginning, by the way, the Israeli delegates to the United Nations apparently ignored her in the beginning, to my recollection. And then all of a sudden, there was a slow change. She was picking up steam. That locomotive was beginning to run. And different political figures began to visit her. Israeli officials began to visit her. We were with her. She began to get some publicity. And she went on for 16 days at some point just taking liquid. She never took any solids until she just finally collapsed after 16 days and was hospitalized. And I just remember this extraordinary dedication. We said, if Silva, who's only 1 year out of the Gulag after being 4 years in the Gulag, can do this, the least we can do is come and demonstrate and stand around her and demonstrate and stand with her and tell our friends to come and things like that. If I remember correctly, there was a chassan and kala, a bride and groom, who came on the day of their wedding, before the ceremony, to visit Silva. And they said, how could we get married without visiting you, who were separated forcibly from your husband?
That's, I never heard that story. Nice. How did you, I mean, what happened, how did you keep the, my mother said also when she was released, okay, at the beginning it was lots of, she went on demonstrations, she
Right.
gave speeches,
Right.
but it was until the second group was released, most of them anyway, in 1979. That's 9 years of keeping the subject alive. How did you, was it a struggle by itself?
Well, because remember, how did we keep the story alive from 1970 to 1979? The answer is because these were prisoners. There were other prisoners who were being fed into the Gulag system. Soviet Jews had found their voice. Soviet Jews were out demonstrating, petitioning, sending out all sorts of information. Travelers were going into the Soviet Union at that point. I went in for the first time with my colleague Maury Shapiro in 1974. You come back transformed. You're there. You see, you hear, you talk to these people. You get on a plane and you leave, and those people are trapped. So we all became witnesses. There was a whole group of hundreds of witnesses who went and saw for themselves. And you just had this tremendous feeling that you had to keep on telling the story. And we found, I think, what ended up to be really the hook, which was not talking as we did in the beginning, years before in the 1960s, about statistics, because there were no people, individuals who we really knew to talk about for the first few years. We talked about individual stories. We found out as much as we could about these people. And we told stories because people respond to individual stories. So we kept the issue alive as best we could. And we developed new methodologies. We took students. We took high school students, college students. We lobbied in the halls of Congress. Anytime a Soviet group was there, we came. Remember also, this was the time from 1972, 73, 74, through 1974, the time of the struggle for the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The Soviets wanted American trade credits. Senator Jackson, Scoop Jackson of Washington State, who had visited the death camps after World War II, and Charles Vanik of Ohio, proposed in Congress no trade credits to the Soviet Union unless they were for your immigration. So this huge struggle took place between the Nixon administration and the Jewish community. Again, first it was the activists, and then eventually the establishment began to join in as well. So all of this took place in this context. And remember also the Soviets in 1979, as an example, they wanted two big things. They wanted that Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which had already been signed by President Ford, out of there. They wanted arms limitations. They wanted so-called SALT II talks. So you had a lot of things were already on the burner, and we try to take advantage of every single opportunity to keep the issue alive. And I think we succeeded.
Yeah, you have.
By the way, if you ask me also, did we know how Edward and Dymshits and the other three. It was Alexander Ginsburg and it was there were two Ukrainian nationalists. How did they get released? Again, there were deals that were done. Rocky, you want to talk about that? Talk about like how things got done? Let's talk about that for a moment, okay?
Oh, you mean like talking, like me talking?
No, me. Let me talk. Okay. In 1979, how did things get done? Well, example, in 1979, there was a delegation of 17 members of Congress who were going to the Soviet Union, who were going to talk to the Soviets about trade and about arms limitations. So all of a sudden, you saw that the Soviets began to do a release. 5 of the defendants from the various Leningrad Hijack trials were suddenly released, and again you had a spy trade. And all of a sudden, at Kennedy Airport, not in Israel, but at Kennedy Airport, the Soviet plane lands, and you have Soviet spies getting on the plane, and you have 5 Russian nationals getting off. You have Edward Kuznetsov. You got Mark Dymshits, who they served 9 out of the 15 years of the sentences. Alexander Ginsburg, a dissident whom the Soviets just desperately wanted to get rid of, and 2 Ukrainian nationalists. So wheels are constantly turning. Again, we may not have known about this in the street when we were demonstrating. Mr. Brezhnev didn't call us up and say, what do you think about this? The president didn't call us up and say, what do you think about this? But we provided the gasoline for the car, the steam for that locomotive to go by being in the streets and creating the public opinion.
Were they all released in 19... Just a second. Okay? Bless you. Were they all released in 1979?
No, and that hurt, because not all the original Leningrad trial defendants were released in 79. People thought again, wow, it was great. Silva was flown into New York, and this was just before the time of the big Solidarity Day rally.
Second cut. Sorry, there's too much. Yeah.
That's a plane. Let's go hijack.
Yeah. And it sounds small as well. Why don't you...
Those are usually
Can
helicopters.
you start the sentence
Yes.
with not all of them were released?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not all of them were released in 1979. And remember, this was a time that we were euphoric. I mean, here's Kuznetsov and Dymshits suddenly showing up in New York days before the big Solidarity Day rally. And I remember, Silva and Edward are standing there with Dymshits on the stage at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza opposite the UN, and they're all, they're pumping their fists and they're waving, and we're all screaming.
Hey, Lily, could you give me a glass of water real quick?
Yeah, me too, please. Thank you.
Okay, readjust.
Danny wants more?
Yes, please.
Reset.
We'll give it a second.
Okay.
Yeah. We need water.
It's cough time. Cough time. Yes, it's allergy time.
You were...
It's a $2,000 microphone, so.
It's okay. Okay. Okay, so let's start this over again.
Just a second.
Okay, let me blow up my nose.
How are you doing on your
It's
list?
allergy time.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. On one hand, we were ecstatic. I mean, Edward and Mark show up in New York, of all places, days before the big Solidarity Day rally. Silva's flown in from Israel, and big rally at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, opposite the UN, and Mark and Edward and Silva are standing there, and they're, going like this, it's great, and we're screaming in the crowd, and we're jumping up and down, and we're just going wild. On the other hand, we realize that there are 3 more defendants. Yosef Mendelevich is going to be in until 1981, ultimately. And Fedorov and Murzenko end up serving their entire sentences of 14, 15 years. So, and as people leave the system, more people are thrown into the system. So it was wonderful to have that victory. It was wonderful. The circle had almost closed, but it really didn't close. But as that circle closed, other circles began to open up as well. So we had other cases to deal with, many other cases to deal with. And, but we knew already that the Soviets responded to pressure. We knew if we're out there in the streets, if we go lobby in the halls of Congress, if we're putting out credible information, if we get Jews and non-Jews across America involved in this, we're getting somewhere. Now, it took 26 years, but the fact of the matter is, ultimately, the Soviet Union dissolved. So it was a hard fight. It was a long fight. Did we think in 1964 that the Soviet Union would even release Jews? No. But that's really one of the miracles of Jewish history.
How do you think this? I was debating myself. Is this a Jewish story or is this a human rights story? What do you think?
Oh, it's not just a Jewish story. It's not just a human rights story. It's a human story, and it shows that people who are determined can change the course of history. It's on the backs of Silva, Edward, Mark, Wolf, Israel, and Yosef Mendelevich that the Soviet Union began to crack open, because Soviet Jews, instead of being intimidated by this series of trials, poured into the emigration offices over here and said, we want to leave. It was exactly the opposite of what the Soviet Union wanted. So history was already beginning to turn. And we showed, if you want to, it could be done. And we were told by other national movements that the success of the Jewish movement in the Soviet Union gave other national movements a lift. It gave them heart. They said, if the Jews can move the Soviets, this implacable, huge, evil empire, maybe we can do it as well. So I think this is the best of human stories. And, if you say never say never, maybe that's what it comes out to. And of course, for Jewish history, this is extraordinary. This is just, again, one generation after the Holocaust, where Jews were forced, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, just to go to the slaughter. Here, Jews symbolically fought back and won. I mean, here you have 1945, 6 million Jews are dead. But then a generation later, you have Jews streaming out of the Soviet Union. Today, 1 out of every 6 Israelis is from the former Soviet Union. Totally changed the course of Israeli history, totally changed the course of Jewish history, and told American Jews, you're no longer the quiet generation of the time of the Holocaust. Speak up for your fellow Jews, and you'll be heard, and you can make a difference, and you can change the world.
That's very powerful. Do you know some facts about how many I would like someone else to say it because it didn't come out right.
In the 1960s, we're talking about a few thousand who got out.
Oh, can you say like the full sentence in 1960?
Yes.
Jews. Yeah.
Yes.
I can tell you how much Yash Academy told me.
If you want to, I can get you statistics.
He gave me, it's like 3,000 in the 1960s. 70s is 300,000. Half of it is from Israel, half of it to America.
Right.
Then in the 80s, I don't remember what he said. But 60s and 70s, definitely, I remember.
Okay. To prove the point of how important the whole story of the Leningrad hijack, if you want to call that effort, is just look, in the 1960s, maybe 3,000 Jews got out. By 1973, the Soviets are releasing something like 55, 60,000 Soviet Jews just to try to get the pressure off and try to kill that Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which linked emigration with trade credits that the Soviet Union needed. Then the numbers began to go down, but by 79 it began to go up because the Soviets understood that we had our hand on the spigot, that if we kept the pressure on, they couldn't get their trade credits. So again, by the end of the 1970s, the numbers went up again. Now, the numbers began to go down again in the 1980s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and there was tremendous problems in the West. And until, even when the great Gorbachev, even when Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union in 1985, the numbers were less than 900 that particular year. But slowly, as Gorbachev began to understand that if he didn't release Soviet Jews, the Soviet Union would continue to be deprived of the trade credits it needed, the numbers started trending upwards until by the end of the 1980s, you had 70,000 leaving. In 1990, it was over 100,000 leaving. Now, ultimately, it was too late for Gorby and the Soviet Union collapsed. But the point of the matter is, it proved the point. The door that the Leningrad trial defendants began to cracked open was pushed open, and it was the door couldn't be shut, ultimately.
Ryan, do you have any other questions?
No,
Like, what are we doing here? What's the meaning of life?
I would like you to read this letter, if you don't mind. Just be careful not shaking the... You can just close up on him if you don't want to... Oh, you don't see him anymore. Okay.
Now, what are you... pregnant when arrested. Okay, so this is not true at all, right?
Yeah, but maybe I'll cut the pregnant part, but I just want to
Okay,
use
so-
the first line.
Okay, so then I'm not going to...
No, just you can... if I put the pregnant part, I'll put later on that
Your mother said
that
it's not
you were
true.
Talking. Yeah, exactly. No, but you said it also it's not true, but...
No, I know I said we didn't know.
Yeah. If I'm going to use the pregnant part, I'm going to use the part that you didn't know. But I would like you to read everything.
Okay, this is... Among the many things we did, we had people said, like, what can I do? I have, 1 minute to do something. So I said, fine, sign a postcard, sign a petition. So this is just one of the petitions that we sent to Mr. Brezhnev. Free Silva Zalmanson, arrested in June 1970. Silva was among the defendants of the December 1970 Leningrad trial. While being sentenced to 10 years, she cried out, "Even now, I do not doubt for a minute that sometime I shall go after all, and I will live in Israel. This dream, illuminated by 2,000 years of hope, will never leave me. Next year in Jerusalem, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither away." Pregnant when arrested, Silva lost her baby in the labor camp. Denied medical care, she suffers terribly from several ailments and may not live long unless you act immediately. Free Silva Zalmanson, free all the Jewish prisoners, let my people go. Now, I must tell you that we sent hundreds of these petitions to the Soviet embassy in large manila envelopes, and they all came back refused. I said, we have in our folders. You can see them in our folders. You
Yeah.
can see the envelopes. It says refused.
Okay, can you take a picture of that and send it to me?
No, you go up to the...
Okay.
You go up there because you may find more stuff that you want.
Oh, it's in yeshiva or?
Yeshiva University. I don't have it all.
Okay, so let's do some visuals. So.
What about that big poster?
While you're even trying to find a frame. Can you look at the light? And can you look straight to the lens now, quickly?
Let me just get this a little brighter here.
Okay, can you do it again? Look at the light and then look to the lens. Then can you get him out of focus and in focus? Okay. but not so fast, like a bit slower. That's good. Can you look to the light again, Glenn? A little bit less, like here maybe?
A little lower.
Like, yeah, stay like this, yeah. And then can you look at the lens? Can you do it again, but slower? From the light and go to the lens. Slow, slow, slow. Yeah. Can you, like, with Scott, can you make it like half a face? Maybe closer. And then pen right, maybe a little bit slow.
Wish you'd see the Uncut too.
Okay.
Yeah,
So go down to the end. Cool, that's good.
Okay.
we
Excellent.
got the poster.
Yeah, and the poster.
So, an Akhbar used to love to bite the KGB. So the KGB weren't it, but they do. So they used to come in with a gun when they went to Slepak's house. They said, if the dog bites us, it tries to bite us again, we're going to shoot him. So when Sasha Slepak, finally, the oldest son, finally came out, he took Akhbar with him to Israel and then eventually to California. But because Akhbar was such a hero, a gibor, I think at the end of Refusenik they have like one little very quick, a photo of Akhbar. This big, huge, black, woolly dog.
Bottom of the mouth.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, are you ready for the final question? Camera? Yep. Sound? Okay, rolling. So, how did the 6-Day War affected you and other Jews and in general? How do you?
That was another jolt. And we had already several jolts, which was 66, Elie Wiesel's book. Why are you Jews in the West silent? 67 war, the existential question of would Israel survive, and by extension, would the Jewish people survive? And the miraculous win in 67. So I think we began to understand also it wasn't just that we can rely upon miracles. We had to act as well. And then 68, again, Arthur Morse's book, While 6 Million Died, posing the question of American Jewish largely silence during the Holocaust. So all these were part of that pressure, along with societal pressures, the civil rights movement that was in full swing at that point, the anti-war movement, which was anti-establishment, anti-authority. These were all the factors that were put in. But I think the 6-Day War affected us, and we began to realize only later that the 6-Day War began to affect Jews inside the Soviet Union. There was pride. This little country defeated all the client states of the Soviet Union. And some of the things that we used to hear when travelers would go, they would come out with stories. They'd say, oh yeah, me and my friends in Moscow, we would walk around greeting each other going like this, Moshe Dayan. So by 1973, when Israel was again attacked and could not respond as forcefully in the beginning as it did in 67, and there was a real question again of whether Israel would survive, again it gave us another jolt. And again we said, we have to constantly be vigilant. We just cannot let anything just go by. We just have to take every opportunity to do everything we can.
And how do you feel it inspired you in the sense that I think because of the win, it's like a David and Goliath story all over again. It's small Israel and it wins the big 5 Arab nation. How do you feel it affected you? Because you were also the small against, the people against a big. Sorry.
I don't think the 67 war affected us in the sense that we were the small and they were the big, but we always, American Jews, you always transferred the Israel, so Israel became the we. I think it gave American Jews a sense of pride. Wow, it could be done. They could do it, Israel. We could do it because we're sort of Israel. We're American Jews. But also at the same time as the pride, the realization that we came just this close, both in 67 and 73, to being wiped out. And if Israel would have been wiped out, certainly no Jew in the world would have been safe. So we understood that these two wars had tremendous ramifications. And Soviet Jews really began to find their voice within about a year after the 67 war, when the first of the appeals began trickling out by Boris Kochabayevsky and other people.
Okay, good. Cut.
Excellent.